So welcome and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Sarah Aoun and I'm a director on the ISTAT board. I'm also head of capital markets at Airbus. I'm joined here today with Niels, who you've briefly met. Niels is also will be co-hosting this session with me today. Niels is the director of the ISTAT PDB program, which you may all be familiar with, and he's also a board member of Novus Aviation. The topic of today's Learning Lab is on global air cargo outlook, good times ahead, the outlook of the global air cargo industry is going strong, driven by rapid growth in e-commerce shipments, robust demands for manufactured goods, among other factors. This trend should continue for some time, which has given Airbus the confidence to re-enter the large wide-body production freighter market when it announced the launch of its 350 freighter earlier this year. Bob Lange, whom I have the pleasure to introduce today, will present Airbus' view of this critical sector of the global aviation industry, the long-term growth prospects and potential challenges. Bob Lange has been at Airbus for 30 years, occupying various functions. Since 2018, he was appointed Senior Vice President and Head of Business Analysis and Market Forecast. During Bob's presentation, I encourage you to send us your questions using the Q&A button and not the chat box at the bottom of your screen. We encourage you to ask these questions early on during the presentation, as the questions will be asked on a first asked basis. So please do not wait till the end. And without further ado, over to you, Bob.
I think you're muted, Bob. Yeah.
I was indeed. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Great. Well, thank you, Niels, and thank you, Sarah, for that introduction. I will, without further ado, share my screen. So you should be able to see a cover page for the presentation as this comes up. And I guess everybody can see that now.
That works great.
Great, great. So before we launch into the slide deck, we published our global market forecast a little late this year. We published it at the beginning of last month. And forecasting during COVID has been quite an interesting journey, as you would have seen with the last Learning Lab in May. We have an echo there? We don't anymore. Great. So it's been quite a journey, and this is the freighter part of that journey. And if anybody thinks forecasting the passenger market is straightforward, the freighter market adds strangely more dimensions rather than simplifying things. It's easy to imagine that freight is a simple commodity. It just wants to go from A to B. It doesn't care what class it travels in. But in fact, when you look at the air freight market overall, some basic facts behind that. Today, around 1% of the weight or volume of freight in the world goes by air. So the rest is going by surface transportation. And although that represents around 30% by value, including a lot of high value just-in-time goods that we all appreciate very well, and not least since COVID began, and in fact since this year, more than 8 billion doses of vaccine which have to be transported in very specific conditions. So COVID to a certain extent has helped the air freight market. We've seen evolution and a great deal of rapidity and brisk reaction to events in the freight market, in some extent compensating for the fact that passenger markets were depressed. So with that in the background, first of all, we'll look back a little to last year, which was when all this started happening. Freight had started to pick up in the years prior to 2019, 2020, after a period of being fairly moribund after the global financial crisis through till 2015, 2016. There was a lot of fluctuation. It was quite difficult for the carriers to adjust. But in response to COVID, we saw overall a decline in air cargo traffic, but that decline in air cargo traffic was only driven by the difficulty in shipping it. As all of a sudden a large block of belly capacity in wide bodies was taken out of the market. The market reacted very swiftly in 2020 with a number of passenger wide bodies that were flying being partly repurposed to carry more cargo on the main deck as well as in the belly. And there was a scramble to bring freighter aircraft back into operation, including some hulls that had been stored for several years. There were a number of surprises of older aircraft coming back into the market. And at the same time, freighter utilization increased around 20% last year. Considering what was taken out of the market, a lot was brought back in. The effect on air traffic overall of COVID was only 11% down compared to 52% fewer movements of passenger aircraft. You can see on the right here the freighter aircraft weekly movements increased over last year. Overall, that meant that the market held up very well, and it held up very well, particularly in terms of revenues, because with capacity being so scarce, there was a very significant increase in yield. So that in turn stimulated many phenomena that we've observed. A lot of aircraft were stored, 15,000 at the peak. And as those aircraft were stored, people were obliged to reevaluate their values. There were a lot of impairments taken against particular aircraft in portfolios. And that stimulated the conversion industry. It was a kind of virtuous circle and cocktail whereby feedstock prices were falling extremely rapidly. I think we all tracked the changes in aircraft values last year and book values. At the same time, a number of interesting freighter conversion programs were rolling out into the market. We already had the 737-800s, which were already on stream, but the A330 P2Fs and the A321 P2Fs were starting to ramp up in terms of rates, in terms of conversion locations, in terms of providers. Consequence of that has been that P2F conversion programs are largely sold out for the coming years. There's very, very strong demand. People who have freighters are doing good business with them. In fact, last year overall, we saw 110 freighter conversions or new build deliveries combined during the year. Of those, around 64 aircraft were converted passenger to freighter conversions. You can see the split there, a lot of single aisle or narrow body conversions in there, fewer wide body conversions. And of course, strong business for people who were delivering new build freighter aircraft. Kind of makes you envious a little, doesn't it? Anyway, it was brisk business, and you can see how 2020 looked compared to previous peaks, 2005 to 2007 in particular, and 2012, 2013 in there. This year so far has done even better than that. And I don't have a chart for it, but there have been, through to the end of October, 126 aircraft, freighter aircraft that have been delivered so far this year, converted and line built together. Now, as we look at history and project forward, we can see that there's always a relation between the freighter market and the freight market and world trade. The two largely track each other. You see little blips from time to time when we've seen the recessions. 9/11 didn't have a huge impact on world trade. It had much more of an impact on passenger traffic. The financial crisis in 2008 was more damaging in that respect. And after that, the air cargo traffic was slightly lagging world trade. The main reason for that was a lot of maritime capacity went in at that time. And what's happened since then is that the tracking has become closer, even if it's a little bit lower. We expect that to converge over the next 20 years, which means that we expect to see an air cargo traffic growth rate of about 3.1% over the next 20 years. When we look at what has happened during the crisis, we can see that particularly since the back end of last year, air cargo traffic in the world has outperformed world trade. Initially, it dipped, and it dipped because of the sanitary crisis and the passenger aircraft grounding. So there was a kind of immediate capacity shortfall before that was rectified, as I mentioned earlier. And since then, there's been much stronger growth, driven not just by pharmaceuticals, but by e-commerce in particular. One of the big winners out of the COVID crisis has been e-commerce. Many commentators would argue that this was going to happen anyway. It's been a trend we've seen coming for years now, but something that's been accelerated by COVID. So you can see that as we got to mid-year this year, we've seen very, very healthy growth in air cargo traffic. Now, of course, we do expect belly capacity to come back. So this imbalance situation isn't going to go on forever. And from that point of view, I'll like to refresh a chart that I showed back in May, which is showing what we call our COVID recovery corridor. Interestingly, and perhaps next time, I'll show the one we showed 18 months ago and see how we actually tracked against the original corridor. Not too badly, in fact. Every time we refresh this graph, it fluctuates slightly. But broadly speaking, you see a recovery corridor to 2019 passenger traffic levels between 2023, early 2023, and 2025 at the extreme, depending on the early to late recovery. As we are sitting, about 10 days into Omicron, I'm sure that with other forecasters in other OEMs, other companies, we're already being asked, what does Omicron mean to us? And we're begging people to stay patient, because Omicron means a diverse set of extreme opinions and reactions until things settle down and we start to get data. In fact, there was somebody who mentioned the other day that an anagram of Omicron is moronic. Now, I don't want to mean that we treat Omicron lightly. Of course we don't. But until we know what it means, people are obliged to take on the principle of precaution. And the principle of precaution, regrettably for our industry, means flight disruptions and restrictions. So as we get more science and more data, we do expect that to settle more into known territory, because we have, through COVID so far, we have adapted in business, we've adapted in society, and we will adapt again. So for the moment, we see no reason to change the view of our recovery corridor, particularly as the back end of this corridor is driven more by the economic outlook and the trade outlook than anything else. But the consequences of this mean that this recovery, as we've all seen, is in multiple stages. The domestic markets have and will continue to recover fastest because they're under a single perimeter of control. Regional markets recover after that, and the long-haul markets are the ones that are the most sensitive in terms of timing of recovery, which means largely there's a surrogate between the long-haul markets and wide-body operations. So it will rely on the settling down of long-haul markets for us to see the belly capacity timing to come back to 2019 levels, but it will. And when it does, there'll be more of a balance between belly capacity and main deck capacity. However, the growth and the gains in growth in e-commerce, and particularly cross-border e-commerce, are not going to be undone. They'll be there to stay, and those trends will consolidate. So going down into a little more granularity in e-commerce, and cross-border e-commerce in particular. We think of e-commerce as business to consumer. It's what we all experience all the time when we're shopping on Amazon or alternative platforms. However, 80% of e-commerce is B2B e-commerce. The difference between the two, B2C e-commerce is typically small transactions, a single customer, very much on demand, and our relationship with different providers is a short-term one. We're also looking for very rapid delivery, and these are typically package shipments. But B2B e-commerce involves larger transactions. There's a more considered decision period before contracting. There are more long-term relationships at play, and delivery is more driven about being predictable deliveries. In fact, the vast majority of B2B e-commerce transactions are for delivery periods above 3 days. Equally, the shipment is more often palletized rather than packaged. And in that domain, there is very clear competition between air transport and ground transportation. When we look at the B2C environment, first of all, you can see a roughly even split between China, the USA, and the rest of the world by value. The business to consumer part of that is 10% cross-border, 90% domestic. There's much more competition even for the e-commerce in the domestic segment between air and ground, whereas cross-border e-commerce is largely air transport. That cross-border segment is worth 300 billion on its own. And what is interesting is seeing the rapid increase in the B2C e-commerce sales, which have been growing faster and faster in recent years, up to and got past 4 billion last year in the business to consumer segment. We're expecting a little bit of moderation in this year compared to the boost last year, which was, as I mentioned, a COVID-fueled boost. And we do see an increasing share of cross-border over domestic, which means air transport will benefit more greatly from that development. So as you can see, I love this chart on the left because as a forecaster, I absolutely hate straight lines, but straight lines is often what we come to. Now, it's interesting looking at the straight line projection of the future and comparing it with the past. And if you actually take out the global financial crisis, the trend in the past was fairly much a straight line as well. So we are expecting continued strong growth in international trade. In the future, it's going to be a little bit more correlated with GDP than it was in the past. And those growth rates will be slightly slower overall. I'm often asked about GDP growth in the context of environment constraints. What's interesting, and if you look at macroeconomic forecasts more broadly, you will see that the more effort the world puts into decarbonization, and improving its environmental footprint, that's actually a stimulant for economic growth rather than a brake on economic growth. Nevertheless, we're expecting GDP growth over the next 20 years of about 2.5%, a little stronger growth in the coming decade versus the second decade, and world international trade to slightly surpass that at 2.7%. When we look at our two main cargo segments, we distinguish between general cargo and express. Express is largely the B2C part of e-commerce, but not only the B2C part. And we see express in 2019 accounted for about 17% of the total. It will take a bigger share over the next 20 years, and it'll be about 23% at the end of the period. Which means that overall we see general cargo growth rate of about 2.7% and express growing at 4.7%. Now the scores on the doors, or the numbers that we see, we've chosen end 2019, beginning 2020 as our baseline overall for our 2021 global market forecast, simply because to have a baseline in the trough of COVID at the end of 2020 is just going to end up with meaningless percentage comparisons. So we want to compare ourselves to the last normal or stable year that we saw. So at the beginning of 2020, there were a little over 2,000 freighters in service in the world. By now, that's closer to 2,100. And we see that over the next 20 years, that will grow to closer to 3,000 aircraft. Of those, we see that around 540 of the aircraft in service at the beginning of 2020 will still be in service in 2019. Sorry, excuse me, in 2040. That is a lower percentage than some other forecasts show. And of course, whenever people look at the aircraft that remain in service, thoughts immediately go to retirements. They immediately go to how long assets may well be in service. We shouldn't forget that at the beginning of this period, beginning 2020, more than 65% of the freighters in service in the world at that time were more than 20 years old. And what we've seen entering service since then has not just been new build freighters and converted freighters, but a lot of older freighters that had simply been stored that have been brought back. Their lives will not be indefinite. The other phenomenon we've seen is a strong growth in P2F conversions available. So these P2Fs will come in, and as more P2Fs and more new build freighters are coming into service, they will displace the oldest assets. So if people are sitting on 25-year-old freighters and wondering whether those will still be in service when they're 40 years old, past experience suggests there will be 40-year-old freighters around, and there will no doubt be some outliers in the sample, but there's a wave of more affordable conversions coming through, and there's more competition coming into the new build space. So that still leaves around 1,500 aircraft today that need to be replaced over that period, and another 950 or so for growth. So adding those together, we see 2,440 aircraft to be delivered into the freighter fleet in the next 20 years, with about 60% of those to replace aircraft in service today, and 40% of those for growth. Now, of course, we split those into categories. Just as with our passenger aircraft, we have the same nomenclature for our demand categories. small, mid-size and large. And let's not forget that our freighter forecast is a demand forecast, not a supply forecast. So it's not telling you which of the conversion programs or new build programs are going to take which share of this market. The small freighter segment is one that we define with payloads between 10 tons and 40 tons. The mid-sized freighter segment between 40 tons and 80 tons. So typically those are segments where the 767 and the A330 play, and large freighters over 80 tons, which are today the segment typically where the 777s, 747s, and in the future the A350s will play. So of those, that demand for freighter conversions, we see roughly 1,000 in the small freighter segment, roughly 900 in the mid-size segment, and roughly 540 in the large freighter segment. Now, we do have a view of a snapshot of, in those segments, what may be the split between converted and new build. And that's, of course, very interesting for everybody who's an actor in the freighter market. But it is something that evolves over time as you see supply changing versus demand. So if we did a segmentation of that market today based on demand and a historical view of supply, we would argue that the small freighters are largely, if not exclusively, conversions. There are currently no new build programs in the market in the small segment. The 757 package freighter was in the past, so there was clearly a niche there. But when we look at whether demand is filled by a new build or conversion, we need to start looking at what the freighter would do. So what kind of utilization it would have, and what kind of markets it would service, what kind of densities it would carry. Clearly the new build freighters have been successful where in markets where utilization was high, where on-time reliability was valued and sometimes carried a premium. So in the past, small new freighters were successful amongst package operators that valued the reliability of a new program, and equally the fact that you can have a whole fleet of aircraft that are identical rather than conversion aircraft of disparate build standard and with disparate conversion packages. Although we would say that the small freighter market, as we see it today, is largely a converted freighter market, that doesn't mean it will always be a converted freighter market, and we can speculate on how that may play out in the next 20 years. When we look at the mid-sized market, we would say that's a market that is roughly split between new build and conversion. Now, if we look at what's happened in the past, the two new build, or the three new build programs that played in that market are largely going to be victims of the ICAO emissions cutoff at the end of 2027, which is 1/3 of the way into our period. The 330 P2F market is really picking up. The 767 converted freighter market has picked up already, but is getting to the point where feedstock becomes more challenging. Many of the eligible airframes are already earmarked for programs, whereas the 330 conversion market is essentially just starting. So will that balance in future be evenly split between converted and new build? Time will tell. It will depend on the success of the conversion programs, and it will depend what happens in that space in a horizon beyond 2028. In the large freighter market, we would argue that 80% of that market is a market for new build freighters, there will be some converted freighters in that space, and the conversion programs that would target that market are already launched. So our view of it is still that it's about 80% new build, and there are 2 new build programs competing in that market, and our expectation is that there will continue to be 2 new build freighter programs competing in that market beyond 2028. A little bit more granularity here, and this will be available to be taken away and downloaded afterwards. It's very important to look at the regional flows to see where the market is growing fastest. And here we see the regional flows ranked by 2040 status. So you can see here that Asia Pacific to North America is the top regional flow. Bigger than domestic US, it will continue to be the top regional flow, and we expect that to double over the next 20 years. The second and third ranked flows in 2019 were domestic US and Asia Europe. We expect those to be overtaken by the intra-Asia Pacific flow, which was 4th ranked before and will move up to 2nd. And we see the fastest growing flows will be Asia Pacific, Middle East, and domestic China, as well as Middle East, North America, which although it's a smaller flow, we expect that to grow faster in the future. We are, particularly with our customers, we're very open to bilateral discussions on the rationale behind these details. We put them out here not to offer them as some kind of gospel or alternative truth, but particularly we feel that it's valuable to all of us to challenge and confront and understand what's behind each other's forecasts, and we offer them in that spirit. When we actually look at the freighter fleet in service in 2040, here by the region of airline domicile, we expect the North American domiciled fleet to continue to be the largest fleet in 20 years' time, but at growth rates that are relatively modest. We expect in terms of number of aircraft, that fleet to increase by 30% over that time scale, whereas the freighter fleet domiciled in airline in Asia Pacific will multiply by 2.5. That is largely the area of strongest growth there, and we include China in that Asia Pacific grouping. This will be my penultimate slide. It's always dangerous for forecasters to get more granular, so I'm not going to take bets on this exact split, and when we show aircraft by region to the nearest 5 or 10, I am much happier over time if we're in the right ballpark, rather than taking these as precise numbers. They were, however, calculated from a model, so I had to persuade our forecasters to round them to 5 or 10 rather than 1, but I'm sure you can appreciate that philosophical discussion. Anyway, again, what we see is the largest growth in North America. We expect to be in the mid-size segment, as well as the largest growth in the large segment. We expect the largest growth in the small segment to be in Asia Pacific. That largely reflects the fact that there is already a significant fleet of small aircraft in service in the US and in Europe. So it's really redressing the balance a little. But again, you can see the relative weightings of these areas versus each other over that period. At that point, it's probably a good opportunity to close the presentation now with a little summary, and then move to questions. So when we actually look at the short-term outlook, we do see a very positive short-term outlook, which is driven both by economic acceleration. Let's not forget that our economic outlook for the next few years is still looking quite robust. And we have been seeing some disruption in maritime transportation. As we see the demand for freighter capacity in the short medium term is going to compensate for the lack of belly capacity, but we expect that capacity to recover between 2023 and 2025 and restore a degree of balance. When we look at the long term, we still expect traffic in freight ton kilometers to almost double in the next 20 years. And we expect much stronger growth in express and e-commerce development, and for that to stimulate air cargo traffic growth, particularly cross-border. We expect the share of express cargo to rise from 17% to 23% over the next 20 years. In terms of the freighter fleet, the fleet in service will increase 50% to around 3,000 freighter aircraft, of which 2,440 remain to be delivered in that next 20 years. You need to deduct the backlogs of the announced programs from that. Amongst those 2,440 aircraft, roughly 540 aircraft in the large category aircraft, for which there will now be healthy competition, and we expect new build freighters to dominate that segment. And Asia Pacific and North America will represent most of the demand for freighter aircraft in the next 20 years. So with that, I'm going to close the slides and try and get back on the camera. And as I do, hand over to Nils and Sarah to manage the questions. Thank you. Okay, so wait a minute. I need to just
Thank you,
sharing.
Bob, for this great presentation.
Am I still sharing, or can you cut me sharing?
We can see you now.
Okay, great.
So thanks very much for this great presentation. There's a bunch of questions that have come through. I'm going to kick off with a couple and then hand it over to Nils. The first one is, do you believe that the various conversion facilities will be able to design, build, and certify their designs and deliver new cargo aircraft, particularly the 777-300ER being the only competitor to the 350 freighter, within the timescale projected? Are they overly confident? Should we be looking at new factory freighters given the advantages? And will Airbus be able to deliver by 2027? This is kind of a compound question.
Yeah, it is, and there are maybe I can kind of salami slice it. Yeah. So first of all, if you're asking me for a judgment on behalf of Airbus on whether guys who are converting Boeing or Airbus aircraft for that matter, other than the ones that are already certificated, whether they can keep to their timescales, whether they can fulfill what they've offered to customers, yeah. It won't surprise you to say that I'll plead the fifth on that. I can't give a view. As a forecaster, I assume that they do, and it's the only assumption I can take. As a private individual, I have my personal view, but you have to wait till I'm retired for me to share that one. Now, coming back to the new build freighter space, of course, we saw with the emissions cutoff in 2027, and with the fact that the only other choice are conversion programs which have, to be fair, very strong and credible backers behind them. But to what extent those would roll out and over what time frame, we did take that into account in our decision to launch the 350 freighter, which was a decision that was very maturely the subject of a mature reflection over several years before we took that step this year. So having taken that step in full consideration of our whole history with freighters as Airbus, including some lessons learned as part of that journey, having taken that step, we are very confident that, first of all, we will have the aircraft delivered to customers in 2025, as we've announced. that we will be ramping up through 26 and 27, and that we will be pretty much at full steam before the emissions cutoff. And I think the market reaction to the 350 freighter, at least the initial reaction, shows a very strong level of enthusiasm for it.
Okay. So you mentioned the growth in Asia. One of the questions was, if you break out China from the new converted freighter demand, how many do you expect that the market how many do you expect that to market for that forecasted period? Like, if we take China out, what do you think that freighter demand would be?
I don't have the number on the tip of my tongue. I should do, but we have a fairly specific view of China, in part because it's linked to the development of e-commerce in the country. So there's a very strong market in China, but perhaps I can come back after the meeting with a stronger view on that.
Okay. So with the recent boom of express P2F conversions, both Airbus and Boeing, do you feel this market is oversubscribed at the moment?
Oversubscribed, difficult to say, because I know that the major programs and the widebody programs in particular are pretty much committed through till 2025 now. What I have noticed in freighter conversions in the past is that they've tended to commit quite late to slots. So the whole market is used to committing 2-3 years out for conversions, rather than 5 years out. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see a slight pause. I think everybody can see the strength long term, and with the softness that we've seen in aircraft values and wide body values in particular, I think that the freighter programs are representing optionality for asset holders. So from that perspective, there's a steady flow coming down the pipe for beyond 2025. I suspect that in terms of current plans to open new lines to deal with very short-term demand, I would expect that there's a little bit of cooling there, and we won't see quite the same rate of increase we've seen in the last 6 to 12 months.
Can I just ask in relation to that question? I mean, do you see a danger that because yields have been so phenomenal for cargo airlines now during the pandemic, because the belly freight has been sitting on the ground, or so the belly capacity has been on the ground, that all of a sudden now with cheap feedstock and high demand for freighters, that there's going to be an overhang of freighters when the belly capacity comes back up again, and that we will have a softness in the cargo market? And if so, is it the wide body segment or the narrow body segment that will be most affected?
I don't think it's particularly the wide body or the narrow body segment. I would just say, if that happens, and it's possible that it might, if that happens, what is likely to fall off the edge? And in my view, what is likely to fall off the edge are the oldest freighters currently in the fleet. The people who've been opportunistic in bringing 747s back that had been stored for 5 years. They're being opportunistic, and they will take the benefit of operating them now in the full realization that they're likely to take the beer can route at the end of that period, if there is a degree of softness. So when you look at the age profile of freighters overall, I'm not worried about the demand for P2F conversions and looking at the feedstock going into those conversions. But I just think you'll get then an accelerated natural attrition of the oldest assets.
Thank you.
Nils, did you have another question?
No, I mean, that was it.
Okay. One of the questions that our audience asked, is the tonnage rather than volume the right metric for segmenting the market, given the growth of express cargo compared to general freight?
Well, there's. I'm going to allow myself, as this is a learning lab, a little diversion into the way freighter stats are reported and why forecasting freight is so difficult for everybody. Okay, I'm here in Airbus headquarters in Toulouse. If I send a package from here to let's say somewhere close by, here to Zurich, okay, then I'm generating some freight ton kilometers, some revenue ton kilometers even, because my kilograms of package is going to take however many kilometers from here to Zurich. If that package goes via the European hub of FedEx, of UPS, or of DHL, it's going to take quite a detour. So it's going to generate twice as many revenue ton kilometers. So there's a lot more behind those statistics than anybody normally divulges, which means that generating the real meaning from that is a challenging thing for everybody who's active in forecasting the business. Now, is ton kilometers the right measure? We don't have anything better to account with. Accounting for volume in that way would be extremely difficult and problematic. And it's linked to the way freight is billed. Having said that, what we have noticed over the last 10 years is that densities have been decreasing, particularly for express markets. So we've seen densities decrease 20 to 25% for cross-border e-commerce, which means that platforms which were a little bit challenged in tons in the past and doing fine in terms of cubic feet and cubic meters, the balance swings a little bit in the favor of those platforms. But what you tend to find is a platform that can carry the volume but not the structural capability is very efficient and adapted for those express markets, but can't do the general freight, so doesn't have the versatility for that. An aircraft that can carry the tons has the versatility for the general freight market, but is a little heavy and inefficient for the pure volume players. So the market is swinging in favor of the lower densities, but the most versatile aircraft will continue to be those that can be applied everywhere. I don't know if that answers the question. It's a little bit philosophical, but
yeah,
it's kind of a philosophical question as well.
Yeah, well, no, but it was a good answer. I was actually curious to see how you were going to answer that one. No, thanks for that. Shifting gears here a little bit. So do you think the market could absorb all the freighter conversions that have current slots booked at conversion houses, or will supply outpace demand?
Well, I think we touched on that one a little bit earlier. And what I do see is that there's been a big rush of ordering freighter conversions. That has, to an extent, filled out the capacity that is not just already there, but being added very rapidly. So I expect there's, in a way, a balance now between likely P2F conversion capability and order books, and that there'll be perhaps a little softening in the speculative ordering of conversions, but that as those programs have developed, the availability will then settle down and match. Let's not forget that when it comes to the touch labor that goes into a freighter conversion, in many cases, the freighter conversion lines are being doing in hangars that are also needed for D checks. What used to be common practice when the freighter market or the conversion market was less in demand than it was today is you would see conversion houses reallocating slots to the MROs they were connected to if a slot wasn't sold 12 months out, for example. So there's a degree of permeability between the maintenance activity and the freighter activity, which means it's scalable on the supply side, up or down, to match demand. So I don't see a kind of bubble that may burst, to use an overused analogy. I see a bubble that may inflate a little and go down a little. A bubble isn't the word. Right. I see a balloon that can expand and contract, but it's also a necessary market measurement. Excuse me. It's a necessary market mechanism to match supply and demand.
Right. Maybe one last one for me on the competing industry. So what is your view on the impact to air cargo demand given severe maritime container ship market issues? And how long do you expect this impact to continue?
Wow. That's a very good question. It's a very complicated question to answer. First of all, there is the container ship market. As it grows, it tends to signal itself quite clearly because the lead times for ships are very significant. So first, we'd need to see the ships coming back into service. We would need to see the orders for new shipbuilding, which we're not yet seeing to that extent. So I expect there will be a resurgence in shipping. However, that is not likely to get much stronger than it was in the 2010 decade. One of the things we have to bear in mind, we see the environmental constraints that are placed upon aviation that we can all see coming. They also apply to shipping, particularly with the types of fuels used in shipping. What we will see in freight, whether it's shipping or aviation, is we'll see the same kind of focus on the tons or kilos of CO2 emitted in freight operations as we do in the passenger market. So those same market forecasts forces are going to be coming into play when people in the future will be doing their discounted cash flow to evaluate a younger freighter against an older freighter.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks, Bob. I think this is it for my side. Niels, do you have any other questions on yours?
Yeah, there were a couple of other questions as well. There's one person in the audience who attended a ISTAT America's panel on freighters, and somebody on the panel mentioned that the 787 was going to head into disassembly if there wasn't, I mean, as soon as there wasn't a plan for P2F when they get older. Do you think that there is going to be a P2F plan for a aircraft like the 787?
Well, for the 787, you need to ask the folks at Boeing. You know, as I've been in the market for since that program was first conceived, I've not seen a presentation on a 787 P2F in any of the conferences I've been to. So I'll leave it there and say, ask the folks at Boeing.
Okay.
When we did the 350 freighter, or when we did the 350 overall, we did very consciously take a different structural approach to our fuselage, and we went for a carbon fiber panel structure rather than a a wound carbon fiber structure. So I know I know what our thinking is for our own programs going forward. One of the reasons we've launched a 350 freighter, but I wouldn't want to comment on other programs.
And the same attendant is also asking about the pipeline for conversions of regional aircraft. What do you see there?
That's interesting, because there are some by regional aircraft. I don't know whether your correspondent means regional jets or regional turboprops.
I think both.
Yeah, well, there are some conversion programs for ATRs that I do know. I guess for Dash 8s also, although those aircraft have value in passenger service when there are not so many, there isn't an obvious replacement for a Dash 8 at the moment, or a Q400. So I guess operators of those aircraft are looking to keep them for a while in passenger service. I did see, as I think everybody else did, that there's some talk about conversion programs for Embraer regional jets at the moment. And there are people looking at conversions of CRJs as well. So there are conversion programs out there. The conversions will do a job. Those are kind of a little bit below the radar versus we define our small category from 10 tons to 40 tons. So that doesn't include those conversions.
Richard Schurman also asked a similar question. He had heard that Embraer had said there was a market for about 700 regional freighters, turboprops or jets.
Well, we've not taken a deep dive into that space, as we don't have product in that area.
Then, Bob, one question: if you were a cargo airline and you had to decide if you were going to take converted 777s or buy a brand new A350 freighter, how would you think about that in terms of fuel cost and capacity?
Well, first of all, a 350 freighter, the easy thing to think about as a 350 freighter is looking at the generations it replaces, because it is the generation beyond the other wide-body platforms. So the way I like to think of it is if you're replacing a quad, you're saving 40% in fuel or emissions. If you're replacing a tri-jet, you're saving 30%. If you're replacing a twin, you're saving 20%. So that kind of, it rhymes in a way, but it's an easy way to remember it. So clearly there's going to be a reduction in energy. There's going to be, it's a much lighter aircraft. I can only speak for the passenger platforms, but a 350-1000 on which our freighter is based is about 35 tons lighter than a 300ER. In empty weight, so that's about an A320 you're carrying around between, if you want to think of it in terms of aeroplanes. But if you're looking at new versus old, you want to look at the fuel burn and the operating cost. You want to look at the emissions. You want to look at the noise as well. 350 freighter is going to be a QC1 aircraft in quota count, so it's an investment for the future. I'm not going to, I'll talk about the advantages of the 350 and leave it there.
Yeah, but if you look at the feedstock of the 777s, I mean, that would be on 777s quite available quite cheaply, and then you look at the payload and the range, and then look at the price after the conversion and for the price of a new 350. I mean, don't you need a kerosene price that's quite high to? make this?
I suspect that you will see the difference in price more than compensated by your fuel savings over 10 years. So then the question is, are you going to get 10 years more life out of a new freighter than a converted passenger aircraft? And I suspect you very much will.
Yeah. Any other questions? Sarah, did you have something on your side?
I don't have any.
Okay.
But if we're going to conclude, I just ask Bob, if you have to pick one characteristic of the 350 freighter, just one of the many that is going to make it stand out on the market, what would it be?
Family. And now you might think, why do I say family? Okay. I joined Airbus when the A320 first flew. Since then, if you look at all the aircraft delivered between the two protagonists, passenger aircraft and freighters combined, about 47% of the aircraft in service today have the same Airbus fly-by-wire family and cockpit commonality. And that has never been available to the freight market before, with the one exception of the 330-200. And it's now coming in through the conversions, through the 321 P2Fs, through the 330 P2Fs. And I'll leave you just with the thought that you can train a pilot to fly an A320 to pilot to fly a 350 in 8 days with the approved program.
So what is the timeline here? What is the timeline on the 350? What is the
first deliveries 2025?
Okay. Great. So if you liked Bob's presentation, then you may want to look up his learning lab from May 11th on the path to recovery for aviation in general. And that's also, if you want to compare Boeing's view on the cargo market and you missed Tom Crabtree's learning lab on October 26th, you can look those up on istat.org under online content and on-demand recordings. So you can see those. And then I want to remind you that on Thursday this week, on the 9th of December, at 10 o'clock New York time and 1500 hours Dublin time, you can ask Adam anything. And this is Adam Pilarski, famous former economist with McDonnell Douglas, working for Avitas, and regular speaker at ISTAT, and also an award winner at ISTAT. So, and you can ask him anything. I mean, this is a real opportunity. So don't miss that. Thursday, 10 o'clock New York. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining in. See you at the next one.